All right, we can get started. Those of you joining us, again, welcome. This is a brand new short series we're having with a special guest of ours. And uh, Doug Levin was tremendous in helping us think through AI in the enterprise that we launched last fall. By last fall, I mean the fall of 2019, and then transitioning it into a monthly webinar that we've done here at the Laboratory for Innovation Science. I'm Jin Paik. I'm the director here and senior researcher at the lab, focusing my research on open innovation and the application of digital technologies such as AI. And Doug, as some of you know, he has been a co-host of ours in our AIE, AI in the Enterprise series. And Doug is actually very, he's very friendly, so we love him. But two, he comes with a wealth of knowledge. Doug was the founder and CEO at Black Duck, which sold back in 2017. So he was very successful in that way. But among other things, Doug is now involved in a slew of companies that are doing a lot in AI and cybersecurity. So if you got questions about that, please send them in as we go. Just again, some checklist things for today. If you can stay muted, please have your camera on. That would be very helpful. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Doug. Again, Doug is an entrepreneur in residence here at the Laboratory for Innovation Science at Harvard. As I mentioned, he's a serial entrepreneur. He's got a good eye for the things on the market. He plays both the advisor and the investor role, and then also does some startups as well on his own. Doug is going to be doing a 3-part series, so please join us again for the next 2 parts. He's going to run through exactly how that works. And Doug also, again, just by way of background, for those of you guys who know Professor Kareem Lakhani, Doug and Kareem have known each other for some time now, about 20 years. Actually, back in the MIT days when Kareem was a graduate student, Doug and Kareem shared an office together. So that's how they know one another. And I'm sure he'll have more to say about that. Doug earned his bachelor's degree from UNC at Chapel Hill. And we're very, very happy to have you here. This will be a bit interactive, so please put your questions in the chat. We'll address them, some of them as we go, and I'll have some questions of my own as well. Without further ado, Doug, the floor is yours, man. Please take it away.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks, Jenny. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thanks again to LISH for sponsoring this series. So there are many motivations behind creating this series. However, the primary motivation is that there are a lot of advisors in the startup ecosystem today, and they are taking on different roles. And in taking on different roles, naturally, there's been all kinds of feedback from startups, emerging companies, and established companies. And some of that feedback has been frustration with the mistakes that they've made in selecting advisors. And some of the frustration has been on the part of the advisors in their mishandling or being underutilized or just simply wasted time they've done, they've encountered with startups. So I've set out to examine the sources of advice as well as providing advice to advisors in a sense through this series. The audience for this series include CEOs of startup companies, board members, and company leaders, but also fellow advisors. So I've invited a number of advisors in. We'll see whether or not they attend. And also over, as I'll explain shortly, there'll be, our next session is dedicated to the advisor's point of view. This one is about the startup's point of view. And as a result, angel investors, VC, business school students, as well as faculty and people in the startup system will hopefully gain valuable new information and perspectives from this series. So this event is about how to choose your advisor from a startup point of view. So I've taken a lot of feedback from the startup community, from CEOs, board members, and other people, and identified the sources and types of advice that startups are looking for these days. And it's expanded significantly as the advisor role has expanded. Advisors are involved at different stages and in different functions. So the selection process and the engagement process are oftentimes challenging to startups, because after all, many of the startups are staffed with people who are coming directly out of school and never taken on a company advisor. While they may have engaged with mentors, they've never really engaged with advisors. And so some of this is new to zero stage companies, but it's also new to later stage companies who are looking for specific advice along the way. So I've come to a number of conclusions that I'll share with you at the end of this presentation. Also, equally important are the upcoming sessions. So on April 28th, we do our sessions here on Wednesdays at 11 o'clock. And so at the end of April, we have the second in this series, where we provide insights into how advisors might choose a startup to provide advice to. And that takes an entirely different point of view from this presentation. And then the third in this series occurs on May 19th, where we will put together a panel of both advisors and CEOs, and I will moderate that panel. And we will discuss the issues and provide some answers about today's advisors in the startup ecosystem, as well as in established and emerging companies. So finally, we should have videos on this series posted to the Startup and Advisors webpage that LISH, that I think Jenny is showing right now. So without any further ado, let's talk about advisors and advice. There are many sources of advice in the startup ecosystem, and naturally there's some very important ones that everybody knows about. Everybody knows about the board and the type of advice that comes out of a board, and also everybody knows about the immediate circle surrounding the founders as well as the startup leaders, and that immediate circle will include founders' wives and husbands and family members, as well as legal counsel and classmates. But this startup ecosystem extends outward and includes people from the industry, like industry analysts. And it also includes the media, which is ubiquitous and can't be escaped. There are so many articles about mentorship and coaching and advising, and some of them don't make a very clear distinction between those different options. And that's the fundamental problem with being an advisor. When you are an advisor, you're exposed to all these input. And finally, there's some excellent sources of advice that you can get from customers. Customer counsel can be excellent, but there always comes a warning with that. And that warning is that customers can be wrong and narrow-minded and don't understand the startup circumstances. So you always have to weigh customer advice. The final source of advice is also an interesting one recently, with crowdsourcing being an inherent part of building business plans and building companies. Many startup leaders, founders, even board members and others go to coffee shops and source many forms of advice. There is a company that I've been recently involved with in California that has built a product that was based on information that was garnered from one coffee shop and 3 co-founders over a period of 6 or 7 months before the pandemic. They still go to the coffee shop and pick up coffees to go. But what's important to note is that they basically built a company in the startup, which is not unheard of. It's actually quite common. But the important point is that they are continually finding advice from those people that they've been connected to at that coffee shop over Zoom. And so crowdsourcing your business plan, financials, as well as strategies from coffee shops, even bad coffee shops like Starbucks, or even better coffee shops like Pete's. No matter what coffee shop you go into, this is a source of advice, but it also comes with a warning that advice can be also structured in a way that we suggest in later slides, and can be much more helpful than advice that is crowdsourced. There is also some advice by function, and that is available by engaging with various members of the startup community who either have domain expertise or who have experience serving in this role. The first one, which stands out, is the type of advice that the CEO needs. And here an advisor can play the role, but also there are mentors and coaches who provide advice. It's important to note with mentors and coaches that they are simultaneously also helping with the soft negotiation and soft side, the soft social science side of doing the CEO role. So they are dealing with psychological factors and also emotional factors of being a CEO. The advisor may give straightforward advice about performance of the CEO. And that sort of advice can be carried over by the advisor, one advisor or multiple advisors, to executive leaders and heads of business units. But on the performance side, certainly board members and investors, and especially COOs, are very valuable sources of guidance and outlook for the CEO and executive leaders. So they play a role in the advisor's ecosystem. In addition, as you know, the board plays a very important role. But outside of the standard fiduciary advisor role, it's important to note that the board members provide a particularly important role in an informal capacity. I find that board communications outside of board meetings, maybe even outside of board dinners, are oftentimes very, very valuable for shaping CEO and executive leaders' opinions and outlook on the company. But you can also get these form of communications not only from an advisor, but also from investors and legal counsel. In three areas, the market, as well as finance and business and technical, these three areas lend themselves to advisor input, but also input from others. And so that input does have a mix of strategy plus tactics. In the market area, for example, there is strategy plus response. So if a competitor emerges, you can go to your advisor, you can go to these other members of the startup ecosystem and your company's circles, and get advice, which is both strategic as well as tactical. And that's one of the important things to know about an advisor and people who are providing advice. The guidance can come in at a strategic level and give actually practical instances and experience behind what are the next moves. Oftentimes, the next moves can be anticipated, and this is a particularly important characteristic of an advisor who can discern issues that may be coming up after a number of steps. So seeing in front of the company and seeing around corners is a very important part of being an advisor. But simultaneously, in addition to strategic advice, there is this tactical advice that is very important. You can see this in markets where tactical responses are very important, as is strategic advice. So then you get, oh, sure.
Yeah, so we have a question here from Eric around, what is the recommended amount of time a CEO should be spending seeking guidance? And then we have a follow-up question to that as well. But just, it's not an exact science, but what would be your opinion on how CEOs should spend their time getting guidance?
Well, I think that is a very good question, and it's all relates back to the CEO and his needs or her needs, the company's needs, and the circumstances. Sometimes, for example, there are CEOs that when I'm providing advice, I sometimes spend hours with them over the phone. And if my guess is right, and it's Eric Graham who asked that question, he knows that I'm willing to put in the amount of time that's necessary to offer all the advice that's necessary on particular issues. But then there are a whole series of engagements you can do either during the course of the week or during the month. For example, I'm an advisor to a company that does a combination of edge computing and software that analyzes Internet of Things devices. And this is a new market. It's a new technology. It's based on open source technology. And what we do is a 1-hour session every Monday at 11 o'clock. And it's a can't miss meeting. So both the company as well as I never miss that meeting. And that's 4 times a month, so it's 4 hours per month. And that has been very helpful for this company, both because of the regularity of the meeting as well as the duration. They prepare for the meeting in advance, and we're there for an hour of really intense. We sometimes run over, and it goes into the lunchtime intentionally. But nevertheless, it's a very productive meeting because it's highly scheduled and structured.
And just to follow on from that, from the CEO perspective, it's a question from Richard. When's it not so wise to follow the advice that you're getting from your advisors?
Oh, so when is it not so not so good to follow advice from advisors? Well, the guidance and the input that advisors give can be based on their own domain experience and their own background, and that can be extensive. And it sometimes happens that a startup will be engaged with an advisor and don't have the access to other advisors. And so there should be caution when applied to advice that comes from an advisor who doesn't have direct domain expertise and is basically stretching the scope of their advisory engagement with the company. So if, for example, a pure financial advisor to the company who's just has been a former CFO and perhaps did multiple financings, is providing market advice or providing engineering advice, you can see where those types of input may be not as high quality as the financial advice that that particular advisor has been engaged around.
Great. We'll have more questions. Let's move on.
Okay, Jim. So sources and types of advice can be varied. And when I first put together these slides, this is one of the first slides that I did. And, it's important to note that there are many different areas that an advisor can be applied to. One of the areas, as I mentioned, is financial strategy. Another one could be product roadmap. Or still another area is in scaling the company. With these engagements, an advisor can be with the company from a very early stage to a later stage, or can be involved with a very short period of time, that they are engaged with the company. So for example, international expansion may come at a much later stage for a startup, and maybe just starts out with an advisory engagement that occurs over a year, perhaps a year and a half. And during that time, the initial forays into international markets, into perhaps Japan or the English-speaking markets, may occur with this international advisor. What happens subsequently is a full-time, perhaps VP of international or international marketing manager or other international headcount is added to the company. And that is an ideal time for the advisor to transition out or transition over many of the responsibilities that he or she had in the initial phase. It's important to note, though, again, that there is a whole realm of advice that is increasingly seen in the market that surround the founder stage of the company, where the founders are involved with all kinds of new things related to a startup, and bring in advisors early, zero-stage advisors, as well as pre-Series A advisors, who help the company do very specific things, or sometimes sets of things, which help the founders get to the next stage. And so, especially for founders, the Swiss Army knife advisor is oftentimes very useful. This Swiss Army knife advisor may be a former CEO or a former or a current board member in another company, or an advisor who's been an executive officer in multiple companies. And this Swiss Army knife advisor could provide, for example, business modeling advice, as well as financial strategy advice, cross-functional advice, advice about hiring, advice about international expansion, when to time that, as well as many other types of advice. So Swiss Army knives, those type of advisors are very, very important for early stage and later stage companies, and can be used variously at various times. But it's also important to note that instead of a Swiss Army knife, a company could engage several different advisors and form a board of advisors. It's important to note that that guidance and input and feedback from one advisor is at one extreme, and at the other extreme, that a board of advisors, which may be 2 or 3 or 4 or even 5 or 7 advisors, may represent a big difference. The reason why I call them extremes is because with one advisor, the management overhead is relatively low. However, the stress on that particular advisor and the necessity to cover many different areas is particularly obvious, right? So but on the other side, the management overhead of a BOA is significant. Getting the communications right in a BOA is a very complicated thing. I can testify to being on a BOA in a company recently, a very successful company, where there were 5 advisors, and the BOA did not work out well. And the reason why is they were all very strong advisors, but the communications around what they were doing with the company and when and where they were doing it was so problematic and so demanding on the startup that they didn't get it right. And as a result, the BOA was, over a period of time, terminated. 2 advisors lived out of that BOA experience. I was one of them. What's important to note is that the overhead connected to a BOA is significant. It's the overhead that is required by the CEO, as well as the executive officers, and other personnel in the company to get a BOA functioning correctly, as well as the advice connected to it distributed evenly around the company.
So Doug, on that, how does a CEO really think about a brand new CEO, never having done a startup before or never having gotten into this? And there's excitement. You might recruit a bunch of people to be on your BOA, but when is it sort of time if the tensions are rising or the communication is ineffective? Essentially, that's still the CEO's job to tap into those board of advisors. But from your perspective, when's the time if it's not working, or you've got 5 people and 3 of them don't agree? When do you think about that? Because again, the CEO has a lot of things to do, and you don't want the BOA to trip you up, and you're thinking about the BOA all the time instead of going out and doing the things that you're supposed to be doing as a CEO.
Good question, and applicable to the situation that I found myself in. When there was feedback from executive officers, from the CEO and the advisors that it wasn't working, that the company wasn't ready for a BOA, or the company wasn't supporting the BOA fully, that is when the CEO must look at disbanding the BOA. It is a undertaking that has to be thought through very carefully before you commit it. It's not one of these things that can be slapped together. And I mean, it's the difference between a BOA and a BOD is that the BOD has people have fiduciary responsibilities there, and that is a major driver and an underlying theme, as well as an underlying strength to those board meetings. Also, the long tradition of board meetings, you can get lots to read and lots of support around a BOD. But with a BOA, you sometimes this is new territory for many companies and for many individuals who are serving on the BOA. So what ends up happening is that, and parenthetically, many BOA members are taking those positions in order to join a BOD at some future date. So many BOA members are people who are BOD members who are board members in training, and they have not gotten the requisite training and experience that is necessary to be successful at the board level, the board of directors level, that they apply to the board of advisors level. And that actually happened with the instance of that I experienced. So with respect to the BOA, it is a different animal than a BOD, and BOA members it's desirable to have prior board experience in order to get the best out of the BOA, and CEOs should know that.
We have 2 questions here, if we can tackle them quickly, Doug. Regarding sharing of financial information, should the board of A, how much should they have? What's the baseline here in terms of previewing the finances and structure of the org and profit sharing, et cetera? Is that something that's common with BOA, or are we talking about more BOD on that kind of, obviously BOD, but what's the guidance around that?
Usually there's a member of the BOA who is a financial advisor, that is helping with the financing of the company. Maybe multiple members of the BOA are helping with the financing. That's a very good example of giving fiduciary kind of information to an advisor in order to properly equip them with the information that's necessary for them to give advice. BOA members should have rock solid NDAs in place with the company. Advisors, even though they say they're under NDA and want the same conditions as VC, oftentimes not operating with an NDA, should be under an NDA. That's a rock solid recommendation that I have.
Yeah.
But let's be clear, the BOD members should have access to all the financial information, whereas the BOA members should have a subset.
And then also, we got a question here from Tom. How do you suggest startup operations think about the halo effect of bringing on an industry celebrity as an advisor versus bringing on an operator with less external cachet, but maybe more relevant operational expertise?
Well, that is an excellent question, and it's come up. It has come up multiple times at multiple companies under multiple circumstances. So, for example, during the internet bubble, it was almost requisite that you have some kind of celebrity on the BOA and or among the advisor group. And equally recently, there has been also celebrities involved in venture capital as well as angel investments, and even in one or two cases, football players and celebrities providing advice to startups. I come from a pretty conservative school, and the reason why is because I'm an operator. I'm a multi-time CEO and sat in every seat in the in startups. So I tend to think that an operator can provide much better advice than a celebrity. But I also think that an advisor who is a celebrity can provide a social media dimension as well as a kind of a celebrity dimension to the company. That is particularly important for a B2C company. It's less important for the B2B company. For B2B companies, having celebrity advisors mean that you get a Fortune 500 CEO to sit on your board of advisors, or you get a multi-time CEO who has exited, or run famous startups on your board of advisors. So there's a whole range of celebrities and big names that you can bring on. Generally speaking, however, my advice to CEOs who are thinking of it, building a board of advisors or even adding advisors individually or in tandem, that they should look at operators because they provide the best advice. And then as a secondary thing, add one or perhaps two, depending on B2C versus B2B, celebrity advisors.
Great, thanks, Doug.
My pleasure. So continuing on this BOA issue, and it's an important one, you can actually segment the various issues that are facing startups and emerging companies and later stage companies and form a BOA first based on issues that the company needs input on and guidance around. So that may mean one area which is transitioning to an emerging company from a 0 stage or a later stage startup. That emerging company has perhaps 10 to 15 to 20 million dollars in ARR. And so the operational expertise of an advisor in that realm is quite different from the operational expertise of an advisor who might be an early stage advisor or a later stage advisor. And then there are other areas where advisors can be, the issues around an advisor on a board of advisors can be identified. So for example, in the sales, marketing, and partners area, there are so many issues where they can be isolated. So for example, GTM strategy and sales op input and brand, all those things require specialized background that a startup or an emerging company simply may not have. So pre-selecting those issues and aligning them with the advisors on the board of advisors can be a very, very helpful exercise. And this slide in particular, where you delineate the responsibilities of the BOA, increases the likelihood of a successful BOA, where advisors are kind of segmented in the advice that they provide, and the company gets the requisite advice that it seeks. And the engagement vectors can also be pre-aligned. So one engagement vector is the across the board approach, where advisors have access to and interact with BOD members and the CEO, the executive team, as well as business units and disciplines within the company. Or the advisors could just be interacting with product engineering, marketing, and sales, and not necessarily, providing advice directly to the BOD at all, or the executive team, and maybe providing direct feedback to the CEO. So there is this model that has to be clearly thought out about the engagement vector for the advisors before the advisors are put into place. And one of my favorite topics is that of the MEO. Many people don't know about the MEO. The MEO is a massive expenditure of energy around different subjects that occurs in early stage and later stage companies. The MEOs can be, for example, getting the culture right, or getting the first sale or set of sales for a startup, or it could be gaining traction on the plateau. So as many of you know who run SaaS companies, there is a significant plateau at the B2B, among B2B companies at 10 to 12 million. And breaking through that particular plateau is a very important element of scaling. Well, bringing in an advisor who has expertise in the industry that you're in is a very efficient way of helping the current executive group, assuming that they're your long-term, executive group, and bringing in an advisor to augment your current group of executives is a really, really helpful way to help the company get through scaling. But there can be other MEOs, and these MEOs can really dog a CEO, and it can dog executive leaders, and it can dog the entire executive leadership group. And so it may actually be problems that exist for months, and expenditures of energy can be very significant in trying to fix these problems. And that's a time where it's a very good, where an outside advisor or a BOA can provide a very important linchpin in getting to the next stage and out of the MEO. But it's important all along, and I say this to all the CEOs who ask me for advice on advisors, is to understand the impact of the advisor, especially on big issues. Advisory services can achieve a lot, but there are some very important things that startups and emerging companies focus on, such as market and product fit, ARR, and customer, and gaining customers. And advisors have to be you have to align your expectations with what you're asking for. You can't ask for unrealistic results from adding an advisor. So unfortunately, I've seen at an MIT startup, some very good advisors being added to a company where there was unrealistic expectations, but because of the stardom, let's call it, of these advisors, the startup just formed unrealistic expectations. And so what's very important to understand is, number one, set expectations with your advisor. And two, understand what inflection and some of these big topics are. inflection occurs, which is the J curve, of course. After a period of time, it requires time. It doesn't, there are very rare startups that go from 0 to 1 million in ARR in the course of months or even a year. And so this situation requires a real solid look at how you're doing it and what are the expectations for the advisor coming in. And so with that in mind, you can also see that there is great complexity in achieving product fit and market fit, customer traction and adoption, and building brand, for example, another issue which startups attempt very early on. And more often than not, there are 3 key elements that play a very important role in an advisor helping a company achieve these big tasks of product fit, for example. And these 3 ingredients are the leadership team, the ability for the company to execute, and luck. So what I've learned from doing 20, 30 years of startups is luck plays a big role in all this. And sometimes an advisor can't, instigate luck or trigger luck. But sometimes an advisor can help with the leadership team as well as the execution of many of these, big topics and help a company achieve these complex big topics over a period of time. I'm sure this will raise questions, but I'll go on to the next slide. This is a slide where startup CEOs have to pay attention to big VC-defined goals. Everybody who is a CEO or involved with startups understand that in order to get your Series A, you need an ARR or annual recurring revenue of $1 million. And in order to get your IPO, you need an ARR, a forward ARR of 75 million. These goalposts are very significant. And no single advisor, I think, can get you all the way to the end. Sometimes there may be an exception out there, but I don't know of that one. Typically, you need one advisor to get you out of the vision phase, and that advisor may be accompanied by multiple advisors who get them to get the company to other phases in the action, which ultimately result in actualization. To be clear, there are 3 phases that I see here: vision, realization, and actualization. And the realization phase is when those KPIs, one of them being ARR, is realized. One single advisor, especially a Swiss Army knife type of advisor, can get you to that stage where you may be receptive to a Series A investment. But from that point, a company should think about multiple advisors, and those advisors can help the individual executive officers as well as business units get to the actualization stage, which is significantly afterwards. When is the best time to add an advisor? This is similar to the question earlier about timing of the BOA and timing of advisors. Well, the best time is when there is a perception by the CEO that there's a gap. And that gap might be a gap that is related to expertise, domain experience. It may be related to markets. It may be related to very specialized areas such as international. So what's important to note, though, is that the type of advice that an advisor gives has to be, you have to come to grips with it during the actual advisor selection process. So the first step in that advisor selection process is outlining the the requirements of the advisor. And to that end, the advisor is filling company needs. One need may be providing the CEO with input. One need may be providing the executive leadership with market expertise or market advice, real-time market advice from people who are in the market. The other steps in this process are fairly straightforward. Introductions. When you're getting an advisor, you're getting someone who could literally influence the course of the company. So getting warm introductions are very important. And when you're talking about the interview stage, one of the tricks of the trade is to get a set of interview questions prearranged before the interviews occurred. That is a coordination function inside the company that is typically done by the CEO, who's interested in finding, the basis for hiring these advisors. Subsequently, the references stage is an important stage, but one stage which again must be coordinated with from inside the company. And then the final two stages, which include the beauty contest and the compensation package, are also important phases, which result in the winnowing out of the advisor pool and the identification of the advisors who would be best suited for the company. Ultimately, the compensation package is a direct function of whether or not you have one or many advisors, one advisor who is a Swiss Army knife, and what stage that the company is in. So this is a complicated process, and it's made ever more complicated by the fact that it is, in a sense, a two-level process. It's the conventional stages that we just discussed, as well as the subterranean phases that we will discuss with this slide. This subsurface journey includes matching domain expertise against people inside the company. This can be a challenging thing where you're trying to determine whether or not the advisor has the requisite domain expertise and experience that matches well with your executive management team. Secondly, you're looking for their understanding of implementation strategy, where it unifies, where it segments, where it separates. Implementation strategy, because advisors go into the belly of the beast, it's important to know what their philosophy is in implementation. And it's also important to know two other approaches. That is de-risking a company, if you're a general advisor or advisor providing executive, especially CEO level advice, as well as professionalization advice. So professionalizing a startup is a stage which occurs quite often with Series A, where you're trying to transform the culture from a zero stage culture into a Series A culture. And getting an advisor to provide that type of advice is an important and necessary stage or advisor to be added to the company, but one in which requires a lot of thought and coordination. The next step in this subsurface journey is testing the advisor and his or her ability to discern storm clouds. This ability to see around corners or discerning storm clouds is a very important function of the advisor, because after all, the executive management is quite often focused on the day-to-day and being stuck in the forests and making that journey successful. A advisor who comes in has to be able to think ahead of that journey through the forest and give advice to executive managers who are stuck in maybe tactical implementations. And then it's fairly straightforward to understand through back channeling sometimes and other means, finding out the record of success, the mutual chemistries and other intangibles that ultimately result in a successful identification and engagement of an advisor. We will have a few minutes at the end to answer any questions about these and other slides. But before we do, I do want to make a set of conclusions and emphasize a couple of things that I said along the way. An advisor can have an impact on a company, and it all depends on the stage that the company is in, as well as the expectations that are set internally as well as externally with an advisor. Startups have to define expectations and deliverables. That is a key element of success related to engaging an advisor. The advisor-CEO relationship is the key relationship when an advisor comes in. Even if the advisor is giving advice on an operational basis to a business unit or to a business unit leader, like a vice president of marketing or a vice president of finance, or even to a board member or a CEO. What's very important to understand is that when advisors come in, the advisor-CEO relationship is a very key relationship. And it's equally important to understand the type of structure you want with individual as well as multiple advisors. What approach is best? I tend to think multiple advisors are better than a BOA, but a BOA may be very useful for a company. So I don't have to tell you that highly technical scientific companies have big boards of advisors, oftentimes scientists and PhDs. And so having a BOA is a very functional thing, but equally functional are very strong individual advisors that you put together in a small team as opposed to a big BOA, and drive the advisors individually as opposed to through a BOA. And finally, one of my pet subjects are MEOs. These MEOs are a major driver for bringing on an advisor. That is to say, when you have a massive energy outlay or expenditure, such as getting a company funded for the first time with a Series A funding or even a seed funding, that may be a BOA. I'm sorry, that may be a MEO that necessitates an advisor or a set of advisors that get a company from one stage to another. So identifying the MEO and then subsequently identifying the solution to the MEO is a very important thing that may necessitate an advisor. So with that, I conclude the slide portion of the show. If anybody have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you for your attendance.
Doug, this is great. This has been terrific. Very well thought, very well laid out, very easily digestible material, and things that are, again, require a lot of strategy and thought. A couple questions we have here in the queue. Eric asks, how do you recommend handling BOA or BOD when they've run their course? So what do you do with the advisors or the board of directors when they've sort of exhausted their time with this startup company?
Oh, that's an awesome question, Eric. So strong CEOs are basically individuals who understand the life cycle of products, executives, BOAs, BODs, and all the other elements of the company. It turns out that the guy who asked the question is a strong CEO and understands this. I want to say that the BOD is something which is a permanent artifice for the company. And however, individual board members may have to be transitioned over a period of time. That may be because their personal lives have taken a turn. So, I've been on a board many years ago where a board member had a loved one that they lost and became a less effective board member. And after a couple of board meetings, it became apparent, and this required a really intense conversation. But those conversations have to be had at the BOD level, and similar sort of conversations have to be had at the BOA level. I mean, when advisors come into the company, they oftentimes develop a very personal relationship with members of the executive staff, the executive leadership team, and the CEO and board members. So personally, as an advisor, I have very close relationships with many companies. And, at some point when my personal utility has been lessened as a result of either, for any number of reasons, I would expect a conversation with the CEO or potentially a board member, and where there is where my performance is pointed out, and maybe the equivalent of a PIP or a performance improvement plan is put together, or maybe there is just a agreement that comes to pass where there is a transition that occurs for a BOA member to just leave over a period of time. So, you have to take in summary on this issue, you have to take into consideration life circumstances as well as the circumstances of the company. Sometimes the companies outgrow board members. It's that simple. BOA and BOD members. And but what's very, very important is that the CEO has open, direct, frank conversations with members of the BOD and BOA, and has the ability to have those performance improvement discussions as well as termination discussions.
Great. I think we have time for 2 more questions, Doug. If you can answer at the same time, that'd be great. Practical tools for screening advisors for, fit, their network, personality, and so forth. And then the second question is, what about compensation packages in terms of whether it being cash or equity only?
Okay. So I've noticed over a period of time that startups, very early stage startups, especially people with first-time CEOs and first-time founders and first-timers in general, tend to linger on LinkedIn. I love LinkedIn. My son actually works for LinkedIn. I just love LinkedIn. However, LinkedIn is not the be-all and end-all of sources of information about advisors. I strongly recommend that startups think about LinkedIn being simply the first step in a multi-step process of vetting out advisors. So advisors, require a whole set of references. It is not unusual for advisors to be asked to produce 5 references, not just 3 references. And these references are with companies typically which are both successful and unsuccessful. And, getting input from all manner of other people. So if, for example, the advisor is an academic advisor, you can go into Google Scholar and look at what they've written. You can also do all kinds of vetting using Google in general. And if you have celebrity advisors, you certainly need to talk to their advisors in order to really understand that, and set expectations around their involvement in the company. In the interest of time, I will I could go on forever on that subject. However, I will talk about compensation, which many people have asked me about over the last couple of years. The answer is simple. It's stage specific, experience specific, and deliverable or mission specific. So in early stages, advisors can get, especially on the stock side, anywhere from a quarter to a 1/3 of a point if they've a highly defined position. But in early stage companies, it's also not unusual to have 1 or 2%, especially at a 0 stage. And so some star-studded advisors can get as much as 3 to 5% when they are at a very early stage. Those star-studded advisors are more often than not Swiss Army knives. And then at later stages, there's a much more defined infrastructure. And the reason why I say infrastructure is because at later stages, you have to coordinate the advisor stock with the compensation committee of the board of directors. So after Series A, you're talking to, you're involving other people, and you're getting the approval of allocations of stock options, which are different. I will also say for among the next session, which is going to be on April 28th for advisors to choose their startup. I will talk about how startups vary from company to company, and the amount of stuff that you have to do, even well-defined, is going to be maybe excessive, and you have to ask for more stock than is usual, because startups more often than not don't know what they don't know. So with that being said, this is a big negotiation, and it's very, very dependent on stage, the capabilities of the advisor, and the mission.
Great. Doug, thank you so much. I want to thank everybody for joining us. And as Doug mentioned, we'll be back on the 28th at 11 a.m. Eastern to talk about the advisor's perspective on this. Again, thank you, folks. Just check out the link, replay, watch it, send us any questions if you've got, and we'll link you up with Doug. Thanks, everybody.